Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. Those of you who have been homeless, what's your scariest story? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I was 19 and needed a semi-warm place to stay. I was in New Orleans and was not dressed for the cold winter night. I didn't know anyone there and found a dark, abandoned house on the outskirts of the quarter. I crawled under the porch and found a place to pass out. I woke sometime in the night to a lot of screaming and breaking things. There's some very serious stuff going on. It turned out it was a crack or meth den I was sleeping under. The fighting continued until just before dawn. I waited for about an hour of quiet before I slinked away. 3 days later, there was a murder at the house. I was relatively lucky because I had a friend take me in after a little over a month, but I was suicidal. I had a plan and was going to execute it, but my friend's dog, a very big dog, sat in my lap as I was sitting on the floor to put my shoes on, and he would not get up. This dog never before had an interest in me unless I was eating, so I took it as a sign that I shouldn't do it. I thought about it a few times after that, but the drive wasn't nearly as intense as it was that day, so I never went through with it. I suffered from something that I now believe is called alcohol-induced psychosis. It's what some can get if you drink way too much hard liquor and begin suffering withdrawals. I would see ghostly figures of people who weren't actually there. I saw bluish holographic people that weren't there. I would hear random auditory hallucinations, and the only thing that seemed to make it die down was to drink beers. Basically, I'd walk down the street and see figures working on their front lawns or friends sitting on porches, etc. When I walked closer to inspect them, the figure had vanished. Sometimes they'd appear erratic, like a person with Parkinson's disease. Once I saw a large, menacing holographic head of a personal friend in a window, and it terrified me. The scariest time was when I walked to the park alone at night. I could hear children's laughter and see figures walking about. I looked towards a fence and saw two figures pointing at me. I kinda just laid down on the ground and shut my eyes to ignore it all. Eventually it all subsided on its own, and I left the park. I haven't suffered any of this since, but mind you, some homeless people are stuck in this hallucinatory state every day, and that must be a living hell to live through. Drinking alone was the stupidest thing I ever did. Please only drink with friends. It's always better anyway. Some others and I hosted a little shindig in the woods of Golden Gate Park. We had a fire and everyone pitched in on food, booze, and stuff. It was a really pleasant night. It rained and we all in little groups wrapped up in big tarps to stay dry. The next day, investigators woke us up, and we thought we were in trouble for our little party. However, sadly, what they were there for was a murder just within a mile of where we were. Golden Gate Park is huge. A young man about my age at the time, younger even, was found dead. Some say beheaded, but you never know what's true. He was a well-liked, rosy-cheeked, red-headed boy who played guitar and was also homeless. It was said a meth addict killed him. You know they don't sleep for days on end, so go wackadoo. Within months, another was found chopped up in Buena Vista Park, just up the road. I've never been so terrified in my life as I was thereafter walking through Golden Gate Park at night, alone and without my corrective lenses. Homeless and glassesless I was. Especially when fog rolled through. I had to make that walk often to get to my camp spot, and I camped alone. I have scarier stories, incidents, and experiences that other people would consider scary, but this is the only time I remember actually experiencing pretty intense fear. Specifically, it was scary walking past the carousel at night. I thought someone could easily hide among the statued horses, but it was one of my landmarks for finding my camp, so I had no choice but to do so. I could be wrong, but on some of those nights, I imagine my fear was well-founded. I often had eerie suspicions that I was being watched by the dark shadows scattered through the park. It could have been all in my head, but Cali is full of weirdos, and whoever killed that kid probably emerged from somewhere dark. Stay safe out there. I know California is going through some stuff right now and has been for a while, and I'm not going to knock it as a New Yorker. Every state and every country has its own problems, but Northern California is pretty dope as far as like parks and ranges. So, been to Golden Gate Park. Lovely. Well, it's been 20 years. I had a crackhead hold a knife to my neck for next to nothing, and a cop threatened to kill me, but the worst was a business owner who came out of his business and asked me to panhandle further down the block. I was sober and polite, and to top it off, I wasn't even in front of his business. I mentioned this and told him I wouldn't move. He snatched a skateboard that had just been given to me by somebody who had picked me up hitchhiking and turned around. I started standing up to try and get it back from him, and the next thing I knew, I was in the back of an ambulance with a broken jaw and a bunch of missing teeth. And to top it off, the EMTs didn't know who they had given my dog to, just that they thought it was my friend. I refused treatment. We were still right where it had happened, and I had to find my dog. It turns out she was with someone I trusted, but the EMTs couldn't even describe who they gave her to, and no one I knew was with me when it happened. I tried talking to some lawyers in the area, but no one seemed to want to help some homeless kid. I think I was 19 at the time, and I didn't plan on staying in that city for more than a couple of weeks anyway. I think I got very close to getting sucked into a gang. I was kicked out of an all-female psych facility completely across the country from my home state. Turns out the tough love drug rehab approach doesn't exactly work with PTSD. I was sent to a crisis center in Phoenix, Arizona, and then brought to a sort of complex with several shelters and resources for homeless people. I still have the card they gave me when I joined. The first night, I had gotten there too late to get any resources, so I settled for the communal dinner they made for everyone. While I was waiting for my turn, a guy sitting next to me in line started talking to me. He only spoke Spanish, but luckily I knew enough to carry on a small conversation with him. It was a lot less scary to face the reality that I was hundreds of miles away from home in a place where I had no resources, when I was just talking to somebody. He was nice and polite. At one point he handed me a piece of rhinestone jewelry. It was a little square. I don't know what it was from. I thanked him, and I kept it for a few years for some reason. When it was our turn to eat dinner, I met some of his friends, and it was pretty comforting to see them so light-hearted in an environment where everybody was so tired and sad. But I kept my guard up. I had my phone off to conserve battery, and I was careful never to mention I had a boyfriend, especially abroad, and did my best not to check my phone so they wouldn't see our conversation over my shoulder. After dinner, everybody was lining up to get into the shelter to sleep. I was walking with the dude, and some guys on the street started waving at him. I hear a single whistle. He whistles musically back, and my blood runs cold. My fiancé lives in a somewhat rough neighborhood, and he had described to me on occasion the whistle sign local gangs and criminals used. He also lived abroad, but I had a sinking feeling that whistling as a direct communication was no different than Morse code. It didn't matter what country. It just mattered where the other people were included. And I did not understand. I look back at the dude, and he's asking me if I would like to come with him. He says something about a school. I was looking at the shelter, which had staff keeping night watch, and back at him and his group of friends. I shook my head. He asked me something along the lines of if I was sure, and I could only reply, "Yo quiero estar aquí." I want to be here. And he shrugged, and he left with his friends. I didn't see him again the next day or two I was there. I don't know why you would pass up sleeping in a protected, watched area when homeless and instead go to a school. I don't know why you would whistle instead of just saying, "Hey, come on, let's go." I just know I had enough red flags pop up for my anxiety to say, absolutely not. Someone called the cops on me for parking a little too close to a neighborhood. The cops knocked and asked me to come out of my RV. Having a dozen guns pointed at you is a really effing scary thing. They never put them down either while asking me questions about why I'm there and asking for my proof. Like, if they wouldn't let me move, how can I get my ID, my work cards, my work schedule, etc.? I only parked near my workhouse because I had 3 jobs that all needed me that day, with one shift starting at 7 a.m. for setups, and I'll be there until 10 p.m. It's really scary to think that, because someone had negative ideas and didn't think I deserved to be there. I could have died if that interaction went wrong. I had been called on maybe 4 or 5 times in the year, and the others, thankfully, weren't away. It was usually just 2 cops, asked me to kindly move, and that was it. This particular cop, ground had a halt and a hard time getting me on something. They towed my RV. It made me miss my shift, and I had hundreds of dollars worth of impound fees I didn't have. We lived in tents way outside of town when I was 14ish. We were homeless for about 3 years. There are so many terrifying stories I have had from that time. We had a central area to the camp that most of the tents were centered around. The tent with food stuff, and the tent with a bucket, a tarp wrapped around a few trees for a bathing area, and then my parents' space. So my grandparents' tent, my older brother's tent, my younger brother's tent, and wanted our own space. So instead of being a part of the circle originally, we had our tent a good 30 feet from everyone else's. The first night we had a tornado. We were between 2 hills, so it mostly jumped over us. Though it also picked my brother and me up at our tent and flung us a good 20 feet or so. We were awake, so we knew what was going on, but it still terrified me. It felt like we were flying for ages. We joined the circle after that, and everyone sort of tied the tents together. We also had some dogs. They were tied up around the central area. One night, we woke up to 3 of the dogs, each individually fighting different coyotes. We chased them from the camp, but the entire time I thought my heart was going to burst from my chest. The 3 fighting were not the only coyotes there. After that, we kept a fire lit in the middle. We'd already had a fire set up and there for cooking, but after that, we kept it burning all night. One night, after dinner but before bed, I decided to do a quick walk around to relax. A good 5 minutes away from the camp, I came face to face with a cougar. It just stared at me and didn't move, but the relentless feeling of there's nothing I could do to stop this thing from literally shredding me right now will stick with me forever. Its eyes were beautiful, but I still see them sometimes when I have nightmares of being homeless. Nobody was allowed to walk alone or at dusk after that. Sometimes the woman who lived nearby would bring us leftover food from the restaurant she worked at. You ever have food poisoning so bad you legitimately get scared you might be dying? That, but over a 5-gallon bucket, and everyone could hear me. I'd chill out at the library during the winter with a book and one of those itty-bitty iPod things I got a few bucks from a pawn shop. Do you remember those? Yeah. It's been a while since I've seen another one. Where the hell mine went to, but anyways, I heard a ruckus so loud I could hear it over my music, looked up, and watched a homeless lady making all the ruckus being escorted out by the cops, trying to take a header off the 5th floor of a 7-story building. Cops yanked her back up again by the legs of her pants, zip-tied her legs together, and cuffed her behind her back, then carried her out like a tribesman bringing home a hog on a stick. She never stopped yelling the entire time about how police hate homeless people and that she wanted to help them finish killing her. I wonder if she's still alive. It's been years. She certainly was a fraction of a second and a couple of strong hands that day from being pulled and becoming the janitor and the coroner's problem. My parents used to kick me out on the reg, but the worst time was when I must have been 17. I was in town sitting at a bus stop bumming the Wi-Fi. I had just gotten kicked out of McDonald's. Turns out they weren't 24 hours a day and wandered around before sitting down at the bus stop. A taxi goes around the block 3 times. Same color, slows down every time. Finally, the car pulls up. He asks if I want a ride in. I say I'm waiting for my ride, and says it's really cold out and I'd be warmer in the taxi. I say no again, and he says fine, and waits in the taxi. I swear, I could see him watching me. I'm freaking out and start trying to call everyone, but my parents take away my service. By some grace of God, my messages work, and I call someone, and they're on their way to me. The dude in the taxi starts playing music and revving his engine, then jumps out again to chat. He asks me who's coming when I called. I tell him it's my dad, and he's just got down the road. Guy starts pulling out and jumps in the car and sits with the back door open for a few more minutes before coming around to close the door and leaving. Less than 2 minutes later, my ride got there. I lived in my car in Oklahoma in the winter with a blanket and clothes on my back. I had a full-time job and couldn't afford rent. I was 18. I finally saved up enough to get a hotel for one night, and there was a brutal ice storm. It was a shitty hotel, and the door remained, so I blew around 6 or 7 and heard it around 2 a.m. The cops came, and I couldn't open the door for them because it was frozen. 20 years later, I was homeless in Minnesota in January. Quite a bit worse, actually. But I didn't have a car. I was on foot. I built a Quincy shelter in an empty lot and wrapped it in a blanket for the night. I ended up living there for 3 days, just terrified that I wasn't going to live through it. But I did.